Hey everybody, this is Aaron Luke with Empyrean Life coming at you. We are continuing the Born This Way series. This is part 3 of the series, as you probably saw through my promotions through all the different means of social media. Definitely need to read parts 1 and 2, which is on the Empyrean Life Spiritual Facebook page. Everything that we will probably be doing from here on out will be here on the Empyrean Life channel. So definitely stay tuned for that, as I will always be updating this. But I definitely want to get right to this. So as I mentioned, you definitely need to cover part 1 and part 2 to really understand part 3, and especially for part 4 when we really get into the meat of the series here, which is what we're doing now. Now, as I warned you through some of my promotion, this is a very sensitive subject matter that I'm going to be dealing with, so it is not intended to be judgmental. It's not intended to necessarily point fingers or anything like that, but it is intended to enlighten, to share truth, and to really put things in perspective, to help people think for themselves in the light of truth. So with that, let's get right to it. So in the first part, if you get a chance to read that, as I recommend, what we deal with is why God created humanity. As we know that he created a male first, that was the human duplication of himself. Adam was made in his image. He gave Adam a mandate, gave him a set of instructions, and essentially what he told him to do was to subdue the earth, take care of it. He also gave him full authority over the earth. So Adam was God's representation of himself on the earth. He then saw that it was not good that Adam was alone, and he created the woman. Now, a woman, as we know from the research from the Hebrew, literally means she-man or man with a womb. Okay, so it is the exact counterpart to a male. It is kind of the perfect equation, perfect complement, perfect kind of finishing off, if you will, for a male. A female was literally created for a male. Essentially, that means they were created one for another. So we know this physiologically. We know this if you study, emotional intelligence and things of that nature. Males and females are kind of each other's counterpart, and that's exactly the way God intended it. So with that being said, when they were made, and again, you need to read parts 1 and 2. When they were created, they were very much in agreement with the way that God created them. It says that they were naked and they were not ashamed. So they were in agreement with the way God made them. As we go on, Genesis chapter 3, we now see that after they disobeyed God's instructions, they fell prey to what happened. Again, you need to read that for yourself. They now disagreed with the way that God had made them. So they were no longer in agreement. They actually looked at themselves and were ashamed of the way that they were made. Now, this is the key point here. Because what happens is when we start to view ourselves or view anything differently from the way God intended it, we automatically get a negative viewpoint of that. And it's very interesting to bring that up. What's key about this, though, is the fact that, again, referencing Genesis chapter 3, verse 5, it says that they would become like gods, knowing good and evil. So as you read my book, and I strongly recommend this as well, this isn't a shameless self-promotion, but it just really helps with what we're talking about. But my book, Is It Really That Simple? It's where we really dive into what God's viewpoint is, why he created humanity, where he stands with everything. Basically, it's a great supplement to what we're talking about. But as I talk about in there, God, the thing that makes him God is the fact that he is the authority. He is the creator of all things. Anytime you are a creator of anything, whether it's a chair, whether it's a car, whether it's a person, whether it's a game, it doesn't matter what it is. If you are the creator of it, you are the God over it, or therefore you are the authority over it. So anytime that somebody or something comes against with a different viewpoint of what the authority over something or the creator of something has established, that person who is saying something contrary is automatically wrong. Why? Because you did not create it. You did not establish what made something the correct way or the incorrect way of use for that creation. So you're automatically wrong by default, and that goes for any of us, okay? So what happens is when they became gods, quotation mark, gods, they became their own authorities. And as we notice, when they became their own authorities, they were now ashamed of the way that they were made. So now whereas they were in agreement with the way God made them and in everything that God was doing, they were now in disagreement with them because they become their own authorities and no longer agreed and no longer liked the way that he had made them. Now, this is a very key point here. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 8, and it says to be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about seeking whom he may devour. So one of the greatest descriptions of Satan and how he works is that he is an opportunist. And I'll never forget when someone told me that. Satan is an opportunist. So he's always looking for an opportunity to come in and disrupt what God has established or what God is trying to accomplish. And we all see this in different ways in our lives. So Satan, being the opportunist, once he saw that, number one, he was able to influence Adam and Eve to disagree or to go against God, he now took the opportunity to further influence them into his direction. Now, Satan, as we all know, is the epitome of self as authority. He wanted to be his own authority. He wanted to raise up his own kingdom against God. That's what he's still trying to do to this day. He was able to get 1/3 of the angels of heaven to join him with that. They all rebelled. So he does have an ability to influence, and he has an ability to get others to do things that they normally wouldn't do. So he was able to do that with Adam and Eve, and they became their own authorities. So what happens is when Adam and Eve fell prey to Satan's trick, it created a cataclysmic set of events or effects, if you will, on all of humanity, and actually affected all of creation. Everything is basically out of order now. So whereas everything was perfect, God looked at it, it was perfect. He didn't have any problems with the way things were made. It even says that he looked at it and he rested afterwards. Now everything is kind of out of whack, if you will, and it's not just humanity, it's even creation. And we learn this from Romans chapter 8, verse 20. For the creature, or the creature, if you will, was made subject to vanity, not willingly, but by reason of him who hath subjected the same in hope. So let's kind of go through that. Let's unpack that, if you will. For the creature was made subject to vanity. Now, we all know what vanity is. Vanity is reflection or focus on the self. When you're vain, you're thinking about yourself. You're looking at yourself. Everything is based on self. So the creature was made subject to vanity. Now, everything that God had intended, where the focus was on him, he was the authority. Adam and Eve didn't even know there was such thing as evil. Everything was absolutely perfect. Everything was focused on God and the way that he established things. Now, all of the focus became on self. They became vain. What's interesting about this word vanity is it comes from the Greek word metaios, which means disappointing misery. Disappointing misery. Anytime that you become self-consumed, it always leads to misery. Now think about that, as many of us have probably dealt with that in our own lives or seen it in the lives of others. When people are so selfish or they're so self-consumed, they're miserable people. They really are, and that's exactly what this word in the Greek means. That's unfortunately the effect of going against God and his ways. When you go against him, you suffer the consequences of that as well. So that's what happened to Adam and Eve, is they now became they became their own authorities over themselves. And as we all experience now through humanity, because every human that was created after Adam and Eve now experiences that exact same thing. We all come out naturally being our own authorities. What we think is right is what in our minds is right. What we think is wrong is what in our minds we think is wrong. What we think is good is what we think is good. What we think is evil, that's evil. So whatever we determine to be right and wrong, good and evil, no matter how it may affect somebody else, no matter how it may be in light of an established set of order, if it's up to us, if it's in light of our viewpoint, we automatically take that as gospel truth, basically, if you will. So where does that leave us? Well, now let's start looking at something, and this you're probably thinking, well, where's the sensitive subject matter? We're getting right to that right now. What happens is when you start to look at some of these moralistic issues, a lot of things you can talk about, whether it's abortion, whether it's homosexuality, whether it's adultery, anything, especially when it comes to interaction between humans and whether or not it's a moral or unmoral thing, it now falls under the guidance of the self as authority. So, for instance, let's take abortion. hot topic, always has been, always will be. Okay. Now, scientifically, life starts when a sperm and an egg fertilize one another. And when that process happens, that by science definition actually means life has started. So if you end life, that automatically means that there is a termination, which means life is no longer taking place anymore, and it was ended. Whether it was intended or not, there was an ending of life. Now, in our country, if we intentionally end life, it's typically called murder, even to the point where if someone shoots a pregnant woman and both the pregnant woman and the baby inside of her die, it's considered a double murder. So, I'll let you I won't go too far into that, but I'm just trying to paint a picture here a little bit of where the self as authority really affects everything that we do. Now, let's talk about homosexuality a little bit, okay? And this is where the rubber really, really meets the road as well. These are probably two of the biggest topics, especially in our country. Now, scientifically, if you do the research, okay, and I really want to start with this because a lot of the things that we deal with as far as the homosexual movement, and when you talk about whether or not homosexuals should have certain rights and things like that, here's what I want to say first. Scientifically, all of the research that exists, and there's a ton of it out there, both Christian and non-Christian, which is, where this comes from, especially online. So all the research out there, of all of it that has been done, none of it conclusively shows that anyone is born homosexual. None of it does. And if you look at the research, again, both Christian and non-Christian research, none of it fully suggests that anyone is born homosexuality. In fact, the statement is made, if you look at some of the research, that people are not born homosexual. Okay? So, if that is the case, then that means, whether you agree with this or not, homosexuality is a choice. Okay, now to put that in light, if let's say you look at it as a disability. Okay, well, if I'm born without an arm, I can't by choice grow an arm. It's not going to happen. It will never happen because I don't have a choice in that matter. I was born that way. There is no choice in the matter. Okay, when you look at something like homosexuality, there are people who are homosexual who no longer live a homosexual lifestyle, and then there are people who were definitely not homosexual, and then they became homosexual in their lifestyle. So at some point, there is a choice in the matter. Now, if you really look at this from a spiritual standpoint, and we go back to that first verse about Satan being a person who literally is walking around and like a roaring lion looking for whom he can devour. If you really look at things, I really believe that what happens is when people feel like they are born homosexual, okay, it goes back to what happened with Adam and Eve. When they no longer viewed themselves the way that God created them, they no longer agreed with it. They felt like something was wrong. It was based on feeling. They didn't agree with it anymore. I really believe that's where Satan comes in, and that's where some of your deep-rooted issues begin, okay? When you're talking about a man wanting to become a woman, or a woman wanting to become a man, or someone being bisexual or transsexual, or any of these terms that we like to use to describe things, I really feel like it's a reflection of the fact that there is a disagreement between that person and the way that they were made, basically a disagreement between them and God. And that's what leads to Satan coming in and sexualizing that unfulfilled part of their lives. Okay, and that's really kind of the only way you can describe that, because even if it's not homosexuality, when you have a deficiency in your life, something that you feel like you are missing, or you feel like is not making you whole, or something that's making you different, or whatever the case is, it can be anything, but you're always going to look for a way to justify or fulfill that unfulfillment, if you will, in your life. And a lot of times what happens is, when you get into this, especially in this subject matter, this is really just an extension of people looking for a way to kind of fill that void in their lives. And unfortunately, it gets sexualized, and you develop an attachment to that. And when you get something deep-rooted and you get something really into your psyche, it really does take a hold of you, and you take on that mindset. You really do. And again, it could be, even if you're not homosexual, even if it's something else, if there's a void in your life and something can come in and give you that feeling of whatever it is that you're looking for, and you internalize it and you become a soul tie that you develop to that, then it will always be a stronghold in your life. It's just like when people have sex with one another. Okay, now there's a lot of research on this, but in general, when people have sex with one another, we develop a soul tie to that person. Now, your soul is your mind, your will, your intellect, your emotions, and you develop a tie to that person. So when you develop a tie to that person or tie to anything, it's always hard to unwrap that. It takes a process to do that. Okay, so sometimes what happens, and I really believe this for people who feel like they were born that way, is at a very, very young age you begin to identify as something different, or in your eyes something wrong, and then that gets internalized to maybe you see it in another person of the same sex. Maybe you see, if you're a male, you may see the bravado, you may see the confidence, you may see a unfulfilled, male counterpart in your life. You may even see that, hey, yeah, we know in a lot of cases where people unfortunately are molested at young ages, and then the proper role of a male or female in their lives gets distorted, so it doesn't feel like there's anything wrong with what's going on there. So with that process taking place, again, what you see is it's very easy for, even at an early age, for you to develop these type of thought processes that lead to a homosexual or bisexual or transgender issue. So let's really bring this to a head and kind of a conclusion here. When you're talking about the self as authority, when you're talking about what we're talking about now in terms of the issues of how you view yourself or how you don't view yourself, whatever the case is, it all comes back to self being the authority. Now, with the particular subject matter we're on right now, when we're talking about homosexuality, transgender, bisexuality, whatever the case is, there's a name for the movement that kind of goes throughout the country, and it's called Pride. Okay, so we know that in several parts of the country, even where I live here, we do have a homosexual pride parade that takes place every single year. It seems to grow and get bigger every single year. Okay, so let's look at the word pride. The word pride means a deep sense of pleasure or satisfaction in one's own achievements. Okay, one of the things that we learn from the Bible is that pride comes before the fall. Now, does that mean that you're not supposed to be proud of things that you accomplish? Of course not. Absolutely does not mean that. But pride, in an overall sense, still has a focus on self. And a lot of times when you are prideful about something, you are boasting or exalting yourself above something or someone else. And that's the case here. What happened, I still remember the Supreme Court ruling on gay marriage, and I remember people, it was all over the media, where you literally saw people mocking the crucifixion of Christ. They were mocking Jesus. They were mocking Christianity and Christians. Okay, so apparently, and again, this isn't to point fingers, it's just, that happened. It did. So the point of that is, obviously people had taken it upon themselves to walk in a state of pride over what had been accomplished. So when you look at this, everything is deep-rooted, again, in self, and self in particularly being the authority. And that's the point that we really have to drive home here when we're talking about really what the fundamental theme of being born this way and what this series is about. It's about the self being authority. Now, what's been an unfortunate result of the self being authority is we've gotten exactly what we wanted. Whether we've gotten instances, things that have happened in your life and the lives of others, whatever the case is, the reason, and really, to be perfectly honest with you, every moral issue that we deal with in humanity is a result of the self being authority. The things that you do towards one another or you don't do towards one another comes down to whether or not you view yourself as your own authority. Okay? So, in wrapping this up, we're really going to get a great sense of this as we come to part 4, which is going to be the final part of this. What has self as authority left us with? And that's what I want you to think about as you listen to this message. With you being the authority, someone else being the authority, with something other than God being the authority, where has that left us? We're going to find out in part 4. Stay tuned to the Empyrean Life channel. Look forward to hanging out with you again.